My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight or whatever the time is, wherever you are. Before we start, I should acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia, recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture, and I should pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'll hand over in a minute to Jean Huang, who's the Deputy Director of the Center and the Chair for tonight's event. But before I do that, can I just remind you that if you wish to ask questions, and you're very welcome to later on, please do it through the question and answer function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And Jean will then read the questions out. Okay, over to you, Jean.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining this very important event, I think. So exactly 2 weeks ago, Russia started a large-scale war against Ukraine. And despite its stated commitment to sovereign borders, and China's response to this war is deeply controversial. We are very glad to have this multidisciplinary roundtable, which combines renowned speakers at home and abroad to explore the historical source, political impacts, legal dilemmas, and economic significance of this war for China, and also for the world, especially the Indo-Pacific. These are all huge questions. So today we get a big panel. So let me introduce our speakers in their surname alphabetical order. Professor Vivienne Bath is Professor of Chinese and International Business Law at the Sydney Law School. Welcome, Professor Vivienne Bath. Mr. Lowen Colleague, who is the Industry Fellow at the Greenfield University's Asia Institute. He's also a double Walkley Award winner and a Graham Perkin Australian Journalist of the Year. Thank you very much for coming, Lowen. Professor Bing Lin, who is Professor of Chinese Law at the Sydney Law School. Professor Bing will focus on the public international law issues. Thank you very much, Bing. Mr. Raphael Pantius, he is the Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute and Senior Fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us. And the last one is Associate Professor Jingdong Yuan. Jingdong is a leading expert in Asia-Pacific security, Chinese defense, and foreign policy at the Sydney University Faculty of Arts and Social Science. And today, I'm going to take the liberty to organize this roundtable in 2 parts. So the first part, we are going to invite each speaker to talk 5 to 8 minutes. And then we are going to have 35 minutes, very exciting, to open up the floor. So we welcome you to join us by making your questions. So as David mentioned, please, if you have any questions, please put in the QA function. And we also welcome our speakers to pose questions to other speakers. Okay, now let's just start, okay? So let's start from Jingdong. And Jingdong, actually my first question for you, 5 to 8 minutes for you to respond, okay? This is not a job interview, okay, Jingdong? Actually, I'm very curious about the sources of the current Ukraine crisis, and especially when we consider the changing global geopolitics. So would you please, tell us the nature and implications of the Sino-Russian alignment, and also Beijing's challenge in balancing its various interests and benefits and pitfalls for China of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Please, Jingdong, now the floor is yours.
Jingdong, you are. Thanks, Jane. I think let me just maybe focus more on the nature of China-Russia relations and very briefly touch on the sources of current Ukrainian crisis and the Russian invasion in particular. But I think Mr. Pentucci will have more to say on that topic. Now, China-Russia relations has a very long formal title. It's called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era. So you can see some of the President Xi's imprint on this very long kind of a title to describe this relationship. Now, some people describe this relationship as a kind of a quasi alliance. I don't think that is the case. But others dismiss this as a marriage of convenience. I think they probably are not paying enough attention to this relationship. So I will just cover maybe 4 dimensions of this relationship to display the nature of this relationship. Now, the first, most important one, of course, is the security military. So here you have military cooperation, arms trade, you have a military technology cooperation. In recent years, you have lots of joint military exercise, both through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and increasingly in bilateral context. So they have recently, in recent years, they have held joint military exercise in South China Sea. So that is a very sensitive area. A second area, I think the dimension is what I will describe as the diplomatic, geopolitical, and normative dimension. Now, both countries are strongly opposed to the US sort of hegemony in the international system. They promote multipolarity, a fair and new international order, and then strongly object to US spread of democracy or the criticizing other countries of their human rights record. So remember in the mid-2000s, they both, within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization framework, they strongly opposed the so-called colored revolution that the West staged in Kyrgyzstan and so forth. And elsewhere, you can see they are both very adamant as far as geopolitical consideration is concerned. One is for Russia, obviously, the NATO expansion over the last 20 years threatened Russia's interest. For China, it's more about first Obama administration pivot to Asia or this rebalancing. And in recent years, of course, the revival of the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue among the 4 countries, and most recent last September, the AUKUS between Australia, the UK, and the US. And they also the 2 countries align their partnership within a number of multilateral organizations, SCO, as I mentioned, but also the BRICS, which also include India, South Africa, and Brazil. And then also there's a trilateral dialogue between China, Russia, and India. So through all of these forums, these 2 countries coordinate their policy, have common positions. Now, third one is economic dimension. I think here is primarily in the military kind of a trade arms sales from Russia to China, certainly the first 20 years after the Tiananmen incident, where Western countries impose arms embargo on China. But in recent years, there's been expanded to military technology cooperation. And then the other areas, obviously, we all know is the energy cooperation, where China and Russia have signed up a very long-term, LNG sort of a supply from Russia. So that may have some implications when we talk about sanctions on Russia. And finally, I think this dimension is unique in the sense this is very personal. So I think President Putin and President Xi have met nearly 40 times. I mean, there's no comparable pair of world leaders with that frequent kind of meetings among themselves. And one story show that once Putin delivered a birthday cake to a party, to celebrate President Xi's birthday. But I think a two fundamental principle is that they both share their kind of grievances against the U.S. They both see U.S. as a major threat. The other is both could not afford becoming alienating each other or becoming enemies, because they do share more than 4,000 kilometer long border. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union stationed over 1 million troops along the Sino-Soviet border. So in that regard, they don't want to become enemies. So that's from the other perspective, they want to maintain a stable, cordial, and on occasions very deeply cooperative relationship. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Jingdong. So I just want to resonate, regarding at the end you mentioned that the personal, very close relationship with Putin and President Xi. I also look at some commentary that actually the relationship between these two presidents are not really equal, because China, also may, later I think other panelists were going to address this issue due to this war. Actually, China, essentially Russia will rely more and more on China. So this personal relationship or the country to country relationship may not really be equal. Okay. So with this in mind, let's turn to Raphael. And Raphael is an expert, especially regarding the Central Asia. So my question is, how does the current Ukraine crisis fit into the history of the Sino-Russian relationship, and in particular events in Georgia, Crimea, and now Ukraine, and also the impacts of the crisis on China's political international relations? And please, Raphael.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel and speak to you today. So I think to start with, looking at the events in Ukraine as we're seeing them play out, I think the key thing we're learning is how close the China-Russia relationship has got. And I think the most interesting way to look at this in some ways is to look at the events that we saw in 2008 in Georgia, the events in 2014 in Ukraine, in Crimea, and then today. And if we take events along this trajectory and we look at these three instances where essentially the Russian behavior was roughly the same, we have an aggressive Russia, which looks at countries in what we still describe as the former Soviet space, as basically extensions of its own sort of territory, and tends to treat them in this way, and will occasionally pursue acts where it will recognize, nationals or Russian citizens within these parts of the world and sort of claim them as their own and essentially annex parts of neighboring countries. Now, when Russia did this in Georgia in 2008, this was on the eve of the famous, Beijing Olympics, which was meant to be China's big coming out moment. And it was something that was received very badly in Beijing. And we actually saw at the SCO summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit later that year, when President Medvedev went to the summit to try to lobby the members of the SCO to support Russia in its actions of what it was doing in Georgia and recognizing the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, to actually get pushed back. And in fact, get Beijing, led by Hu Jintao, actually going out and lobbying others to push back on Russia's desire to try to get acknowledgement. We even saw the Chinese MFA putting out statements in which they said they were concerned about Russia's behavior, which at the time, it's worth remembering, this was not the Waijiabu of nowadays with the wolf warriors, shouting angrily about the United States. This was a very staid institution that rarely passed any comment on anything with any sort of great vigor. To actually come out and actively express concern about what their ally was doing in a neighboring country was really an expression of how unhappy and unpleased, how displeased they were at what Russia was doing. At the same time, there was still important and budding China-Russia relationship going on there. And so we saw while Beijing did push back in some formats and did express some concern, we didn't really see China actually do anything about this. And we've actually seen in the years since that China has actually even started to engage with the governments of these two breakaway republics, reflecting the fact that in a way, Beijing has kind of let things play out and essentially started to continue to engage with both sides. They've still got a pretty good relationship with Tbilisi, though recently it's become quite challenged as a result of the sort of growing relations that we've seen China develop with Abkhazia in particular. If we then cut forward to 2014, and the trouble that we saw first express itself in the Euromaidan protests, which led to the evacuation of then leader Viktor Yanukovych, who fled to Russia, and then subsequently the Russian-led invasion of Crimea and the starting of sort of instigation of trouble in the Donbass region in Luhansk and Donetsk, we see China coming out fairly quietly. We don't see them actively condemn what the Russians are doing, but we don't also see them particularly actively comment on it. We see them broadly say, well, you know, we can kind of understand what's going on, but basically China avoided trying to get enmeshed into that problem. At the time, of course, in 2014, China had lots of other things on its plate. The troubles in Xinjiang were getting worse and were sort of showing up in other parts of the country. And this was consuming a lot of energy at home. And there was lots of other problems around the world that frankly had China's attention. And so at the time, frankly, this was small European wars. Russia was doing something. They were very close to Russia and were getting closer to Russia as we saw the kind of Western relationship with China and Russia become more tense. And so there was no real interest in actually condemning China. But at the same time, there wasn't much of, in condemning Russia, but at the same time, there wasn't much desire to actively go out and openly support what the Russians were doing. If we then switch to now and what we're seeing happen in Ukraine this time around, well, the Chinese have been very careful about not openly, actively endorsing and supporting what the Russians are doing. They really have taken the Russian line much more strongly. And in fact, most of the commentary has been much more about condemning the United States and blaming everything that's happening on the United States, on NATO expansion, essentially parroting what are the Kremlin's narratives in this affair. So we can see that if we look at this trajectory from 2008 till today, we can see that essentially what has changed is China's condemnation in many ways of the United States, rather really than the relationship with Russia, which in fact has gotten much stronger and much closer over time. So I think that in many ways shapes how China is looking at this problem, which is much more through the lens of international geopolitics, where it sees itself locked in a sort of major struggle with the United States and the West, which maybe has been put on hold now because everyone's attention is focused on Ukraine, but Beijing expects that once things calm down there, the sort of energy will come back into sort of the focus on the Indo-Pacific. And within that contest and that global confrontation, they know that they need Russia on their side, and they want to continue to have Russia on their side. And so as a result, I think some of these narratives we're seeing now about China coming in and becoming some sort of honest broker of condemning what Russia's doing, on pushing back on what Russia's doing, are frankly for the clouds, because I think that would require Beijing pushing back on Moscow, which is something that China has no interest in doing at the moment, because while the issues at the moment might be focused on Russia and Ukraine, this will pass. And ultimately, the energy will return into this focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, you can see in parts of Washington, this narrative already persists, where people say we shouldn't be engaging in this sort of conflict. We should be focusing on the Indo-Pacific and focusing on confronting China there. And so within that context, Beijing knows that Moscow is very much an important geopolitical ally, a P5 member of the Permanent Council of the UN Security Council, you know, an important military player on the world stage, an important economic actor, if clearly less important to China in many ways than the West, but still a very important ally on the world stage, and one that they will want to continue to keep on side. I want to briefly comment on three other short elements. Conscious of time, I will keep this very compact and brief, which is just to talk about some of the other kind of international geopolitics I think will resonate around this issue. I think the first one is, I think, the strengthening of the Western alliance, and in particular, transformation we've seen in Europe's willingness to sort of step up to the military plate here that has been expressed through this conflict. And while it's certainly true that this is a conflict that's happening within Europe's context, and so therefore it makes sense in some ways that Europe would want to sort of step up, I think this is going to have bigger repercussions on Europe as a sort of military actor on the world stage. And that's something that I think is going to also have a resonance in the Indo-Pacific, though I think it remains to be seen how exactly that will sort of play out. I think the second, it's interesting to look at how India has reacted to what has happened, which has actually been to continue to stay on Russia's side. And I think this is going to be very important to think about going forwards in sort of the Indo-Pacific narratives, because there is a discussion in the kind of Indo-Pacific region that India is a tight ally with the West. But in fact, as we're seeing here in this European conflict, that isn't the case. And I think this shows that probably India is a sort of strong partner in these kind of Indo-Pacific contexts is actually potentially a bit shakier necessarily than we expect. And then the final point I want to touch on is, as Jean pointed out kindly, I do a lot of work looking at Central Asia specifically. And I think Central Asia is a part of the world which is going to suffer massively from the conflict that we see now. This is a part of the world where if we look at Kyrgyzstan, we look at Tajikistan, these are countries which are dependent on remittances from migrant labor going to Russia for almost 30% of their GDP. That is going to plummet. That and the fact that the ruble has crashed and the general sort of constriction that we're going to see on the Russian economy is going to resonate in Central Asia. And that's likely to create instability, unfortunately, an instability that is on China's border. And I think is going to create more problems in some ways for China in its Eurasian neighborhood than maybe it's sort of planning for going forward. I will stop there, having galloped through an awful lot of information, and I very much look forward to hearing my colleagues and the wider discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. So actually, there are a lot of discussion regarding Russian maybe purposely postpone the war due to the China Olympic. I actually read a military expert who wrote a commentary. He said that the pushing postpone the war, actually there is a negative issue on Russian because the weather. So the point is, that 2 weeks, the snow melt, which make the Russian tank and the military, machines and vehicles hard to move around in those very narrow country road in Ukraine. And another thing you mentioned about the Indo-Pacific, actually one issue is Taiwan. So with this in mind, let's go for Lauren. And Lauren, which going to talk about how this crisis will impact on China domestically, especially the Chinese Communist Party. And also, Lauren, I'm very interested about Taiwan, as well as, in this week, the 2 sessions in China, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, both are in sessions. So how this crisis may impact on, Chinese domestically politics. Lauren, please.
Thanks very much, Jean, and hello, everyone. What does the invasion mean for the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP? Whatever Putin's original hopes when it began, almost certainly of a blitzkrieg enforcing a swift surrender, the outcome now, 15 days later, is troubling for the CCP, but not yet distressingly so. So why? In answering, I first wish to agree with Raffaello and set to one side the thoughts of some people, too clever by half in my view, that a bogged down and perhaps even desperate Putin will be a better bet for the CCP. Yes, maybe Beijing might be able, in return for its continuing support, to screw down better deals from Moscow on oil and gas, gain even greater leverage over the ex-Soviet stands in Central Asia. But these are hardly core priority goals for the party. The problems caused by today's Ukraine imbroglio, rather than any threadbare opportunities, start with the main aim of the party, and especially of its General Secretary, Xi Jinping, for 2022. That is to preside over a stable nation on continued course for moderate prosperity in a world made safe for the party by respect for China's rejuvenation and its leadership. This would provide the appropriate setting for the 20th five-yearly National Congress of the party in November, at which Xi would be reappointed General Secretary for a further 5-year term, which, because of the ages and experience of the newcomers brought into the Politburo then, would almost certainly morph into a further term until 2032, when he will be just a year older than Joe Biden is now. All other goals must this year be subordinated to achieve this end. So a war, even halfway across the world, is not good for such desired stability. The surprising extent of Western coordination in imposing sanctions on Russia is not helpful either, nor is the inevitable impact of sanctions on inflation, nor, I will argue at the end of my remarks, are the repercussions for Taiwan strategy, as you asked about. Despite this, however, Xi and his party will persist in their no limits partnership with Putin's Russia. Xi will not, as Stephen Roach, for instance, bets, broker the peace that will save the world, to free China of what he calls its guilt by association with Putin. Only Xi, he says, holds the needed leverage with Putin, but Xi won't pull Putin into line any more than he did Kim Jong-un when Kim was facing widespread condemnation over nuclearizing. Xi's three core personal focuses are entrenching correct history, elevating ideology, especially, of course, his own new era thoughts, and ensuring that the entire education system from preschool to postgrads prioritizes that history and that ideology. Xi's focus is domestic. He's not a pragmatist. He's a true believer. He believes fully that the party is China and that with his red jeans, inside, not what he wears, that I've seen, that the party, that with those red jeans, he embodies the party. He and his party reviewed painstakingly what led to the downfall of the Soviet Communist Party and concluded, as Xi said then, that to completely repudiate the history of the party, to repudiate Lenin and Stalin, was to wreak chaos. Putin's attempt to rechannel Lenin and Stalin is thus perceived by Xi and his party as noble and necessary. But of course, there's a big difference. Putin's United Russia party would soon become a disunited rabble without Putin, whereas the century-old CCP will press on after Xi, who needs, for all his centralizing authority, having appointed all key cadres in party and army, he needs to bring the party with him. He, with Putin, seeks to recreate the glory days and the territory of dynastic empires at their most expansive after suffering victimization from foreign forces. But Xi, while a risk taker, and so far a supremely successful and lucky one, tends to move only when he's very confident that all the odds and the Marxist gods are aligned in his favor. On Xinjiang, on the South China Sea, on Hong Kong, on the tech and real estate tycoons, for instance, at the start, on Bolshevik. Putin, surrounded, it would seem, even more than Xi, by a coterie of scared sycophants, has taken on in Ukraine a target too big, too blithely. The two regimes are ideologically aligned, intriguingly, through mutual admiration for the thoughts of Carl Schmitt, who was a prominent figure in the development of the ideology of the National Socialist Party of Germany, a theologian of the state, prioritizing it over all other forms of human organization, and also a champion of the idea of Eurasia as the world's central island, whose control held the key to global supremacy, while the maritime powers, which Schmitt denigrated as inevitably liberal, were doomed to decline. Putin's own ideologist, Alexander Dugin, has written an essay on Carl Schmitt's 5 Lessons for Russia. While in China, Schmitt is perhaps now the philosopher most prominently studied beyond the Marxist coterie at universities, and is often cited with approval. Now, the 5,000-word joint statement of February the 4th, vaunting the redistribution of power in the world, which Jindong outlined in more detail, and which marked probably the warmest moment during the otherwise, in my view, rather Winter Olympics, will not be repudiated by Beijing. This document, clearly drafted chiefly by China, look at the language of it, cemented a strong, if strange, personal tie, Xi having earlier described Putin as my best, most intimate friend. Hard now to shrug aside such a document, such intimacy. The curation of social media, and the unequivocal tone of the mass media have this week underlined the PRC's firm continuing support for Russia, and it's blaming, as we've heard, the US for setting the fire for the war, as Xinhua editorialized yesterday. And even though, as the Australian Labor Party's Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Penny Wong, who is likely, in my view, to be Australia's next foreign minister, she said China's position is contrary to its own long-standing foreign policy respecting other nations' sovereignty. Now, to go back to what the party is saying at the moment, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said on the sidelines of the Lianghui, the 2 annual State Congress meetings on Monday, he said the China-Russia relationship is grounded in a clear logic of history and driven by strong internal dynamics. It is rock solid. But the invasion has set back party goals. China's economy is 10 times Russia's and far more internationally engaged. She wants to make it more self-reliant in order to reduce the party's exposure to risk, but especially in the COVID era, and with the party opting for a zero COVID policy, likely to keep the nation locked away until the party Congress, exports have become, again, almost the sole sector driving growth. The party is not ready to cop severe sanctions itself. It must remain engaged with Western markets. Some international restraint is still required. Nor, and these are my final remarks, is the party yet ready to take the huge existential risk of rolling the dice to seize Taiwan. The PLA is watching closely the struggles of the Russian military to take a physically much easier target in Ukraine. And the idea, as Rana Mitter relayed this week, that the Chinese had viewed Ukrainians as, quotes, Russians really, is turning back on itself. If Ukrainians are viscerally demonstrating now that they are not really Russians, just how Chinese are the Taiwanese, having been ruled by China for just 4 of the last 127 years. No, this is not the hour. Beijing will only move on Taiwan when it believes it holds all the cards in its hands. So what's happened so far is being seen by Beijing as something of a setback, but a containable one. Its core long-term aims, on which she will elaborate at length at the party Congress, remain intact. And she surely still believes the West is declining, the East is rising. As Churchill kind of said, sadly, the world is not even at the end of the beginning of this new geopolitical trail of tears. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lowen. Yeah, just want to resonate with you, China's position for this crisis actually is contradictory to its own long-standing sovereignty doctrine, right? So with this in mind, let's go for Professor Bing Ning. Bing, please, help us to understand, the underlying reason and also very important, the legal dilemma for China at the international law regarding this crisis. Bing, please, yes. Bing, you are mute.
Hello, yes, thank you. So I'm going to talk about China's dilemma from an international legal perspective. I actually prepared a longer presentation, but because my time is limited, I'll just focus on some of the points. So it is commonly observed that China is finding itself in an awkward position. China, obviously, historically, is a strong adherent to the classical Westphalian legal dogma, sovereignty, non-aggression, independence, territorial integrity, non-intervention, and so on. But on the other hand, China is not condemning Russia. China is even avoiding the use of the word invasion. I'm going to talk about China's dilemma from international law point of view in 3 dimensions. First of all, use of force. Second of all, sphere of interest. And thirdly, sanctions. use of force. International law prohibits use of force. That part of international law is reasonably well understood. International lawyers almost universally condemn Russia's military operation as violating the international law on use of force. When you look at the positions of various governments in the world that have condemned the Russian aggression, I think we need to understand that the prohibition on use of force in international law historically has been violated by states all around the world, actually quite regularly. Just almost exactly 1 year earlier, President Biden ordered bombing of Syria in retaliation to alleged terrorist attacks on American interest. That was clearly an illegal use of force against the UN Charter. I don't see any Western governments at that time condemning America's use of force. In fact, when you look at the major Western powers that are now at the forefront condemning Russia, United States, Australia, United Kingdom, France, and so on, most of them have been involved in illegal use of force in violation of prohibition on use of force in the past 10 to 20 years. Australia, of course, was part of the powers enter into the illegal Iraq war, and the United States was a frequent culprit in violating the use of force prohibition. Now, in that regard, China, in fact, has been doing quite well among the major powers. The last time China was involved in the use of force internationally was the 1979 border war with Vietnam. Now, since then, China has been making threats, and China has been having border skirmishes with various states, but China has never, since 1979, been involved in any significant use of force. And in fact, among the major powers, I think only Germany and Japan can match China's record. Now, so illegal use of force has been regular and has been frequent. Russia's use of force is a blatant instance of violating UN Charter. It's a blatant case of illegal use of force. But can we say that in the future, because of national security concerns, states are not going to violate the prohibition on use of force again? I don't think any state can actually make that promise. I mean, they can make the promise in rhetoric, but in reality, I think it is almost certain that states will continue to violate the international law prohibition on use of force. China has not been in use of force for the past 40 years, but will China never illegally use force in the future? I don't think you can say that. So there you have one dilemma that China faces, but it is a dilemma really for many other states. Secondly, on the question of sphere of influence. So China has been saying that Russia has legitimate security interest. The idea here is that NATO expansion to the east, especially the possible inclusion of Ukraine, is a threat to Russian interest. The idea implicit in that is the old idea of sphere of interest. So somehow, Ukraine is in the sphere of interest of Russia, and you cannot really take Ukraine into the NATO and become a threat to Russia. And Russia would have a legitimate case if Ukraine is going that way. So that's the idea. Now, the historical idea of sphere of interest, of course, it is a very important idea historically, and also during the Cold War. We have the Brezhnev doctrine, we have the Monroe doctrine, and the US intervention in Latin America, and so on. That idea of sphere of interest has been very much discredited since the Cold War. Most international lawyers now agree that the idea of sphere of interest is contrary to the international law principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, and so on. China historically has been against the idea of sphere of interest. But even after the end of the Cold War, this idea of sphere of interest seems still to be quite alive in international politics. And China, in fact, considers itself to be the victim of the sphere of interest practiced by other states. So for instance, when China starts to make investment in Pacific Islands, Australian politicians become seriously worried. They think China is threatening Australia by coming into the Pacific region. And of course, with the NATO expansion and now with the US-led anti-China alliances, the AUKUS, the Quad, the Five Eyes, the Alliance of Democracies, etc., I think China sees itself to be victimized by this expanding sphere of interest by the United States. And so here China has a dilemma. On the one hand, China resists the idea of sphere of interest historically, but on the other hand, China can empathize with Russia in seeing its security interests being under threat from the Western maneuvers. And finally, on the question of sanctions, China historically has been opposed to international sanctions as a way of resolving disputes. In China's eyes, unilateral sanctions are not only coercive, but also unproductive. Now, in this case, China is resisting, and China is not joining international sanctions against Russia. But on the other hand, China is worried that its companies might be subject to secondary sanctions from the United States, because if they cooperate, if they continue to do business with Russia, they may be penalized by Western powers. And in fact, for that matter, China enacted the anti-foreign sanctions law last year to address that problem. But on the other hand, as we all know, China has been practicing unilateral sanctions on its own in recent years. China has been imposing economic sanctions on Lithuania and Australia in recent years. So here again, in regard to international sanctions as a means of state foreign policy, China has some dilemma. China has a problem. China opposes sanctions in principle, but opposing sanctions has its price. And in fact, China needs to use international sanctions sometimes to meet its own foreign policy ends. Now, in closing, I would say, as long as you have disparity of power in international politics, as long as you have powerful states at odds with each other, the law prohibiting use of force probably will continue to be violated in the future. The idea of sphere of interest probably will continue to be alive and well in the future. And international sanctions will continue to be practiced and resisted in the future. So in that sense, China's dilemma is really the dilemma facing the current international legal order. When international law meets international realpolitik, we really have a problem. And the problem that China is facing is probably the problem that faces the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bing. Especially on the last issue you mentioned regarding sanction. I think an issue for many business persons that care about is sanction Russian is, because consider Russians small economic, GDP issues, but the sanction, if there is a secondary sanction, especially Chinese enterprise or banks, if they continue to do business with Russia, what will happen? And also, just now, referral discussed about the Central Asia, and especially Ukraine is a very important part of China's One Belt One Road. So how this crisis will impact on China's One Belt One Road? So with this issue in mind, and let's turn to Professor Vivienne Bath. Vivienne, now the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks to all the other speakers. What I wanted to focus on tonight was the question of actually relations between Ukraine and China. We've talked a lot about Russia and China and about Chinese policy, but of course we have to remember that Ukraine is not actually some small insignificant area tacked onto the edge of Russia. It's actually a large state on the west of Russia and on the east of Europe. It is strategically important because of the opportunities that it offers, particularly for China's Belt and Road in terms of rail transshipment, in terms of potentially, as the Chinese and the Ukrainian leaders discussed just last year, of serving as a bridge to Europe for China and Chinese goods. It has a large, highly skilled population. It sells various quite complex and technologically advanced equipment to China. And it is, of course, also one of the breadbaskets of the world and has been increasingly over the last couple of years sending substantial amounts of agriculture and other goods to China. So trade between the Ukraine and China, although nowhere near sort of trade, say, with Russia, has been expanding rapidly. And similarly, Chinese companies have been searching after opportunities in the Ukraine, getting contracts for construction, for infrastructure projects, to build subways. Huawei recently was awarded a substantial contract in terms of connectivity in what was to be the new subway in Kiev, which is of course valuable given that it's becoming increasingly difficult for Huawei to obtain that sort of contract. So if we go back historically and have a look at the sort of agreements between Ukraine and China, China was one of the first countries to actually start signing agreements with Ukraine back when it became independent. It was the third state to sign an investment promotion agreement with the Ukraine in 1992, which is in fact still in force, and we'll come back to that later, in fact. In 2011, it signed a strategic partnership agreement, the 10th anniversary of which was celebrated in 2021. And what they talked about then was Ukraine as being the bridge to Europe for Chinese companies. There was going to be cooperation in the fields of trade and economy, investment, science and technology, aviation, aerospace, agriculture, and infrastructure construction. Interestingly, the china.org.cn website notes that an important content of the China-Ukraine strategic partnership is that they will offer firm support to each other on issues concerning national sovereignty, reunification, and territorial integrity. That was, however, in 2011, and as we've already heard from Raffaello, China's determination to protect the territorial integrity of the ex-USSR states has diminished rather since that time. But nevertheless, in 2017, the Ukraine did rather belatedly sign up for the Belt and Road and signed at that time cooperation agreements in agriculture, energy, culture, and education. The Ukrainian hope was that they would attract substantial amounts of Chinese investment, particularly to engage in the modernization of Ukrainian transport and infrastructure. In 2021, rather controversially, Ukraine withdrew its agreement to a statement criticizing China's activities in Xinjiang in the 47th session of the UNHCR. And this was followed, perhaps not coincidentally, by an agreement between China and the Ukraine to strengthen infrastructure cooperation. So really up until quite a recent time, at the governmental level, both governments were, it would appear, aiming to expand their cooperation in areas of trade and in investment. Ukraine undoubtedly offers a lot of opportunities to China, not just as an exporter of agricultural products, but because due to its location and due to the fact that it has a free trade agreement with Europe, it offers a very good leaping off point for Chinese goods coming across Russia being transshipped into Ukraine, particularly since there are sanctions in place in Belarus, which is one of the traditional transshipment locations, and then shipping goods further on to Europe. So there are many opportunities there, and one can't help feeling that China is, in a sense, by refusing to stand up for the Ukraine in this context, really throwing those away. It's going to be difficult to see whatever happens at the end of this particular event, that the Ukrainians are going to be particularly friendly towards China. In addition, Ukraine, of course, is stuck between EU, the urge to be in NATO, potentially the US and China. And so there's not necessarily a happy history in some ways of some of these activities of Chinese investors in the Ukraine. There's an arbitration going on before the ICC, for example, in relation to a dispute over the construction of a road being done by Sino-Hydro, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And there's a massive investor-state arbitration which has been instituted by Chinese companies. And the reason for this is that Chinese companies essentially saw an opportunity to take over a company called Motor-Sick, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of missile, helicopter, and jet engines, and has extremely advanced technology. This company, of course, was set up when Ukraine was part of the USSR and became a major supplier to Russians, but also to many other countries around the world. And it does a level of technology which is very inviting, of course, to Chinese companies. An opportunity came up after 2014 when this company lost most of its Russian customers for obvious reasons, and Chinese companies started sniffing around then. There are allegations of corruption, illegal acquisitions of shares, until we get to about 2017, 2018, by which time the US was beginning to put on pressure on the basis that it would be very dangerous indeed to allow a company with this sort of high dual use technology, high level dual use technology, to be acquired by or to be handed over to Chinese control. And in the end, the Ukrainian government decided that in fact they would essentially take over the company and turn it back into being a state-owned enterprise on national security grounds. So we have a number of different threads which I think actually stand a bit for the relationship, in that we have the aggressive Chinese search for technology with which we're all familiar through company acquisitions, kickback from both the United States and the EU in relation to the Chinese managing to obtain this sort of technology in the Ukraine, possible corruption in the Ukraine itself, but also a belated recognition by the Ukrainian government that even though China is its friend sometimes, actually having them control this sort of high level technology in their own territory is perhaps not such a great idea. A recognition or a view which has been taken, of course, not just by Australia, but US and all sorts of other countries. In addition, actually, we have rather a curious feature of this particular arbitration in which the Chinese and their partners are asking for $4.6 billion US, which one would think is almost enough to bankrupt the Ukrainian economy should they succeed in the arbitration, which is that as a result of having signed up their investment treaty in 1992, they've never actually bothered to revise it or reform it. And as a consequence, it's going to be quite difficult for them to win in the arbitration because it takes such a narrow definition of what parties are entitled to. In fact, a Chinese company has recently lost an arbitration against Mongolia on a treaty which is very similar and was signed at a very similar time. So there are difficulties there as well. But you have to think that these difficulties between Ukraine and China and Chinese companies really represent the tensions of the US, the EU and China and Russia all sort of battling over Ukraine as a battlefield. And it's difficult to see a way forward, depending what the outcome of the current invasion is, for Ukraine-China relations, unless China wishes to come in on their current humanitarian basis in order to rebuild the country. So I'll stop there and hand over to questions.